Hello everyone. Welcome to today's webinar Wednesday. Gonna give everyone just a minute or two before we can get started today. You're all doing well? Hope everyone had a good week overall, had a nice weekend. We're in Germany where I am currently. We're back in a little bit of a heat wave. So staying cool, staying dark, which is why my lighting may look a little odd, a little bit off compared to normal. It's okay. So I think we're ready to start. So hello everyone, welcome to today's webinar Wednesday. Today's topic: communication. Communicating with developers and speaking their language. So this is for the testers and for us to have a pretty good idea of how we can actually communicate our testing progress, how we test overall, and how we should just communicate in the middle of a project. So specifically in this webinar, I want to look at a couple topics. First of all, I want to look at where miscommunication does occur overall and where it comes from. Then I want to have a look at the different goals of the developers and testers in terms of our communication and in a project too. And then finally, sort of our main topic, and to sort of round up webinar, I want to look at how we can actually communicate and how we can communicate well in our projects. So first though, looking at miscommunication, where does it come from? Let's start with the old adage, the old us versus them sort of story that miscommunication in this sort of sense can come from. Because devs, I may not be correct in saying this, but devs will say that testers just click fins and they delay releases. Maybe this is an old-fashioned way of thinking. I think nowadays developers are much more understanding of sort of where we as testers are coming from, sort of the importance we have to a team. But it used to be known that, yeah, testers just click fins, they delay releases, they don't actually test fins properly because bugs are still seen in production, and they only delay releases and cause headaches for everyone. Meanwhile, testers, we're not out of this either, because we have said in the past, and maybe depending on where we are, still say it, that the developers just build these unstable features that break at a slightest breeze, and then they put the blame on us. Sorry, test developers, that it's not our fault that you can't program a stable feature. And yes, this is hyperbolic, it is overblown, but there is a little bit of a truth to it, or at least a harsh undercurrent of what both sides truly believe. And this is where we start with our miscommunication. This miscommunication of what both sides are responsible for and what they actually do. Because, as I think I've said in one of my previous webinars, miscommunication is a communication issue. Miscommunication can come from a wide variety of areas, and this can be unclear bug reports in which we're missing certain steps to be able to reproduce these bugs or otherwise, or that we're only using dev language in our user stories and our tickets that are created for development. If we're only using dev language in our user stories or tickets, this often means that we don't have a great deal of focus on the testing as a whole, and it means that we're not often too focused on the pure implementation of how things are done, rather than the end goal of why we should implement these things in the first place. Remember, implementing things well, testing them is part of our job as testers. Well, not of the implementation stage, but making sure things are implemented well. So we don't want to have too heavy focus on the dev language. Instead, we want to include some more tester language in there as well, because the tester language helps us get that definition of done, helps us understand when a user story or a ticket has been completed, or when it's still just missing that tiny little bit more. Maybe we're having some issues about assumptions, about ownership. where we have some unclear responsibilities about how defects should be reported or resolved between the developers and testers. Maybe they're not too sure about once the tester reports the defect and the developer creates a fix, where to from there? Is the developer the one who should try and rerun the tests? Should the tester do that themselves? Maybe there's some assumptions there that need to be cleaned up. Maybe we have some fixes that just haven't been looked at in a while. We need to clear these up and so we can properly communicate. Maybe there's a lack of known priorities in our testing as well. Maybe we understand the user story and what it says, but we don't understand what needs to be discovered in the testing itself. Sure, our user story of user can log in is basic enough. User can log in, but what does that mean? Does it mean they can log in from the home page? Does it mean they can log in from its own separate login page? Does it mean they have to send their own request just to this URL to log in? How does that work? So we have to prioritize. We have to understand what we're actually testing and how we're testing things. And this is all about communication, all about language that for right now is in our user stories, but this still holds true throughout the entire development, because an important aspect when we're talking about projects like this is that project stress, and project stress happens, it heightens the blame game. And what I mean by this is that in really fast-paced environments, like you'll see in agiles with fast-paced sprints, nobody wants to be seen as pulling down the team. Nobody wants to be the reason why a release has to be delayed, why a sprint has to be incomplete in terms of its features. Nobody wants that. Because depending on where you're sitting in that team, the blame is slightly different and the reasoning can be quite different too, because we as testers, we need time. We need time to have a look at what the developers have made. We need time to make sure that it's correct. Not only that it meets the user story, but it meets all kinds of requirements too. And then, not only do we need time for the testers, we need time for the developers, because they potentially need to debug their features as well. And that also takes time. And remember, project, high stakes, a lot of stress. It's really easy for that blame game to start, so we need to make sure that we test early, test often, so we can give time where required. Because ideally, what we want the whole team to work together, so the blame is shared equally. We talked about this in a previous webinar as well, but the whole idea of a team is that blame is shared. No one person is responsible for any outcome. It's always between at least multiple people, if not a whole team or multiple teams overall. So we really want to make sure that everyone communicates clearly and well, so that we don't have to place individual blame. Instead, blame can be shared for our whole team, because then it's less blame for a general person. So what happens in a project? Well, as we know, working on a project is of course our end goal. But how we reach that end goal, how we reach that finished piece of software, it does greatly differ depending on sort of what team we're in or where we find ourselves. Because if we're a tester, then we just need to ensure that the software meets the client specifications and requirements there. And I say just like that's an easy thing. No. Understanding what the client means when they give their requests, understanding how those requirements should be met, or at least how we can ensure that they're met. That's difficult, that's complex. It's asking those clarifying questions. It's further getting those requirements and specifications even weeks or months after you start a project to go, hold up, we're not sure about this, let's investigate this further. That's the tester's responsibility. That's how they contribute to a project. And then the developers, they create a functioning software that meets that specification. Now, of course, remember, we just change the specifications here as testers, because we seek to ask those questions about unclear specifications or unclear requirements. We clarify that first, and then the developers create functioning software. Although, of course, we're not perfect. Nobody is. So it may be developers create functioning software first, and then specifications are changed. And this can happen. And in that case, we need to properly communicate to the developer or just the development team in general, hey, I understand you've completed this feature, but you need to go back and change it because it's been a change to the requirements themselves. Maybe not a nice chat to have, but it is an important one, and it's one that will happen frequently. So let's look at a little scenario in terms of sort of the different goals between a developer and a tester. In our scenario, we have a developer that's just completed a brand new feature of a codebase, completely unrelated to what has been done before. I mean, building on from that, of course. So we don't have a lot that they can sort of implement and test with. But they feel confident with the implementation that they have performed, but they haven't really had time to test it properly. Maybe that because this was such a large feature, brand new feature, they've run out of time, or maybe they're just pulled away into another project. Maybe they have a vacation coming up and they just need to get this done. There's a variety of reasons why they haven't had time to test it, and unfortunately, that's no longer the developer's problem, at least how they see it. But they have done at least some tests, and after ensuring that it works on their machine, they make the pull request, they tag in our tester, and they begin to work on their next feature, or any other task that they may have. This is a scenario that I'm sure happens a lot, where developers push a feature out saying, yeah, test it on my machine, it works, no problem. Someone else can look at it and ensure that it's all good. But what happens now? Because now it's left to the developer space. So let's look at the tester's point of view from this scenario. The tester now has to look at the automated tests and even some regression tests that might have failed because that the developer wasn't properly testing them. Maybe we need to look at actually how we structure our development processes, how we structure our pull requests to ensure that this can't happen in the first place. Now, what happens is that the tester has to make defect reports for the defects that were found in this piece of work and inform the developer. Not only that, hey, these were the issues, but also it is generally accepted and it's polite to give the developer a heads up and be like, hey, I know you completed this feature. If it is just, of course, for one developer, or if it's a small group of developers, let them know. To be like, hey, you completed this feature, but I found some issues. I'm going to be opening up a couple of defects. That can you please take a look at it, and can you please work on this when you have time? And what happens then? Well, once the developer gets the initial feedback and can start making those defects, fixing those defects, even if the change has been made quickly, even if the developer didn't take much time to fix those, we still have this lag of pull requests, of responses, and our tester still needs to potentially write brand new tests for this brand new feature. In which case, they've wasted a fair amount of time chasing up on something that the developer potentially should have checked themselves. And this is where that sort of miscommunication, that sort of hostility between the two teams can sort of occur in these kinds of scenarios. And so the best thing we can do is to try and avoid those scenarios entirely. So in our scenario, from the developer's perspective, they wrote the code, it works for them, and as the developer, their time is better spent on brand new features that they can make in their project. But from a tester's perspective, their code, and the code that they have, it needs to be completely fixed because it's failing current tests. And either this means they need to investigate if the tests themselves are just failing, in which case the tests may need a rewrite or need to be created better, because not all tests stand the test of time. But maybe also, or the other alternative is that the software itself isn't responding correctly. And because the testers are being kept busy in identifying these defects, it also means they can't focus on other existing tests or defect investigations that may have been ongoing. So these are the issues. These are the different goals of the developers and testers in a project. So how do we put this aside? How do we deal with this, and how do we communicate? Well, I think the best way to communicate is with structured and vigorous communication. We need to communicate often, we need to communicate frequently. Because if we communicate frequently, if the developer in that scenario communicated early on and said, hey, I'm having some issues, I haven't been able to run my tests early, then as a tester, even before that pull request, we can get an idea of where problems might lie and how we can sort of suggest solutions, or at least give the developer a heads up in saying, hey, there might be some issues ahead of time. Even that heads up does really help. So how do we do this? Well, easiest step, and what we can do first, is just align early in sprint planning. This means that at the very start of our sprint cycles, assuming we're working with Agile, which most people I think at this point are, we align early to say, hey, what needs to be done this sprint? What user stories are being looked at? What requirements are being met? And what definitions of done are there for each of these requirements? Once we have that, and developers and testers agree on this, it means we're aligned and we know exactly what needs to be done. As testers, we also should, of course, have some experience in understanding where potential defects may lie, so let's make developers aware of that. If they're using an open text field, then they probably need to look at JavaScript injections of some kind. We need to look at where potential defects may lie in our code, even if we don't have a great insight into the specific code itself. Sort of a white box method, we're not doing that. We should still have a bit of an insight, an idea on how we can do this ourselves. We should also look at, maybe not as testers, but maybe between developers or such, to look at pair programming or maybe shadow testing. So where something is written, it's immediately tested to a degree, so we ensure that best quality standards are employed. As if we ensure that the code itself is a high quality, then normally we can feel fairly confident in the test themselves to not only pass, but also to reflect any defects in a clear and obvious fashion. Because remember, not only do we want our tests to pass, we want them, if they do fail, to at least help us identify how it failed. And good, clean code does do that. So how else can we communicate? Well, another thing is with defect reports. Defect reports are, of course, a massive tool in the software tester's toolkit. They are how we let developers know that we have found a defect, how it can be tackled, how it can be investigated further. And so, a good thing we may want to do in our defect reports is to try and standardize the language that we use. Let's try and standardize how we communicate about our testing. We don't want to confuse developers, we don't want to confuse project managers or anyone else who will read our defect reports. Instead, let's use simple and straightforward. I think straightforward is really the key here. Use straightforward terms to help identify where these defects are taking place and why they're taking place. Not only that, but also further information in our defect reports as well. And if we can, let's try and use project and code terminology, project-specific terminology, to help our developers identify locations where these potential defects may lie. Of course, we don't want to get too involved with code. We do want to have some sort of degree of separation from the code itself. But overall, we do want to give them a bit of an insight and idea of where and how this is failing. Of course, if we can identify that ourselves. If not, then we should at least try and sort of rule out some possibilities, potentially. And in our defect reports, this is when we should include additional information where possible, such as any error codes that the software presented us, or screenshots or videos on how to recreate these kinds of errors. These information can really help developers, especially if you give timestamps as well, and there's kind of logging functionality, so that they can get a better idea of what was happening behind the scenes whilst this was being done, or at least give them the steps so that they can recreate it themselves. Now let's look from a sort of management perspective on communication, because it's not only up to us as testers, but it's also up to management, and these are some steps we can help encourage. And I think the important thing for a management sort of point of view is that we want to treat the entire team, the entire project team, as partners. We don't want to break the individual teams into their own groups. We don't want to have our QA team, our developer team, our requirements team. We have those, sure. But what we really want is we want partners. We want everyone working well together. Because we also want everyone to embody some aspects from the other individual teams, smaller sort of inside teams. Because we want developers to care about testability. We want them to understand that actually making things testable, and especially easily testable, greatly improves the overall quality of the software itself. And testers, we don't get out of this scot-free either, because we also really should be familiar with our solution structure. How our project is structured, how it's made up, how things work together. Maybe not in a complete white box understanding. Remember, we do want those sort of degrees of separation, but we should generally understand how a project is structured and how things fit together. Because if we understand that, then that helps us identify where potential defects may lie, or if a defect does occur, where in sort of what components or areas it may be present. This also means, of course, if developers care about testability, if testers are a little familiar with our solution, overall, this should, keyword should, lead to faster releases of our project. It should lead to fewer defects making it through into production, and Keyfin should make less stress overall. So that's a sort of Keyfin testers. Go back to your managers, making sure that you're following these sort of practices, and encourage them so that they can follow those practices, and I think you'll communicate a lot better. So what can we do in the day-to-day though? Well, I think an important step in day-to-day communications is we're looking at that we should look at shared dashboards. So often in QA, we'll have our own dashboard that says how many defects we've currently found and the state of those defects. Meanwhile, developers will have their own dashboard that will look at remaining user stories and maybe a bit of information on defects and bugs. But what we really want to do, and we can keep those separate dashboards, but we should probably try and actually look at a shared dashboard that shares both sides of the story. So not only what developers are currently doing, how they're progressing in a sprint, but also from the QA side. How are they progressing through that sprint? Which components haven't yet to be tested? Which tests have come back negative and need investigation? And this leads sort of into our next point of our day-to-day. Let's do some daily check-ins. Not only between dev and QA, although that is a sort of main one, but daily check-in with the whole project. And this really should be a quick daily check-in, like a stand-up. It should be 5 minutes of what developers are currently working on and what areas, and what the QA is looking at as well. Maybe 15 minutes if you really need it, but past 15 minutes, I think you're getting too into specifics, and either it should be more general and sort of just remember this is just a daily check-in to make sure people are going well. And maybe you should schedule another meeting to discuss potential issues or blockers that may be present, especially if your daily check-ins are taking more than 15. We should also look at an important Keyfin. In case we're looking at specific developers that have developed features and there are defect reports, we should probably reach out to those developers ahead of time to let them know that there are defect reports incoming. It's just a small little thing, and how formal you want to be in this, of course, depends entirely how comfortable you are with developers. But it can just be a small thing of saying, hey, I'm going to send a defect report your way. It's regarding this feature. Of course, they can read the defect report themselves. You don't need to retell it to them in a message or verbally. But just giving them that little piece of, hey, heads up, this is incoming, so that they can be aware of it as well. So it isn't a shock when they get that defect reports in their mail or in their Jira notifications. So how else can we communicate? Well, what about as a team? I mean as a whole team. Well, I think a nice way to start is we can first look at rotating who does our test suite reviews. Once we've made our test suite, how do we review it? Well, normally we get another tester and have a look. And that's cool, that's great. But let's not just stick to QA. Let's also occasionally expand and look at developers too. Developers who can have a bit of an insight into the testing process. Maybe they're not familiar with the framework that we're using to test. That's okay. We should make our tests still, of course, easily understandable and followable. So developers can still come in and be like, yep, that makes sense, what you're doing there. I understand what the test is doing, and it seems right. Maybe the developer won't be as good as another QA in terms of those test reviews. Potentially, in which case, always make sure you have a QA test reviewer on it as well. But it sort of builds that confidence between developers and QA in that sense. And of course, we can do the same thing for developer features as well. Another thing we can do as a team, try to centralize information. This also involves tool usage, and we want to just try and centralize where information is being presented from when we report it, or just when we're keeping information that we can later use, or just general project developments. Because what we don't want is we don't want information to be made available, but it's in 20 different places all around different SharePoints or in different files. No. Let's try and centralize it all together so that there's one place people have to look in order to get that information. And a crucial thing for the whole team, let's ensure that the whole team is actually part of decisions. Not only when we're looking at sprint planning with what user stories are being prioritized, but just general project decisions. Let's try to make sure that all members of the team are brought together. If we have all members understanding what's being decided upon, what's working, then we communicate a lot better. And then what can we, as the testers, do for the team? Or what can we do in general for the team? I think the first thing we can do is look at some shared physical locations. Of course, individually, we probably don't have much sway over this, but as a whole, maybe we can try and convince in management or otherwise that shared physical locations are important. Not only just for one team, not only just for like the QA department, but for the whole project team as a whole. So if everyone's working together physically, then they will just work together better together intellectually too. We can also look at shared communication channels. You know, we don't need a Slack for the developers. We don't need a Slack for the QA. How about we just have one project Slack? Maybe, of course, we can still have our QA and our developer channels, but we should encourage a lot of information to be shared just generally in the Slack so that we're not relying on these specific echo chambers in which we only find parts of our team there. And another key thing, of course, is using retrospectives as growth opportunities. And what I mean here is we don't just hold a QA retrospective and a developer retrospective. No, hold them together. Bring in the whole project team into these retrospectives. Those make for the best growth opportunities, so, where all work can be reviewed. Not just what the developers have made, but also what QA has done. And what can we do in communication as testers? Well, let's be clear where our defects may reside in what we're finding. If we have a good clean eye on the code, then, of course, we want to see the line of code. Because that is probably the best idea and identifier where the problem may lie and how developers can fix it. Or maybe we're looking at an area, or maybe we just know the general components. But the more specific we can be with our defects and our reports and just communications in general, the easier job we make for developers. Then, what else can we do? We can assist developers in creating component tests. Of course, depending on the project structure, depending on the culture, developers may be a little more responsible for component tests than normal. Testers may have a sort of larger, big picture view looking at system tests or system integration, maybe even component integration, but that doesn't mean that we can't assist developers in creating these component tests. Developers, of course, should also be familiar with the testing frameworks and technologies that we're using generally, so that they can understand and read and maybe even sometimes implement them themselves if so required. So just assisting developers in creating those tests if required, that can really help in our communication. Plus, a major component of us as testers is ensuring that all user stories, all requirements have a testable component. Because if it's not testable, then we're in trouble and we're not sure how we're actually going to test it ourselves. So let's make sure that when something gets brought up, not only does it have a definition of done, but it has a testable component so we can ensure that it has been completed correctly. Overall though, and as I'm sure you're probably getting sick of me sort of explaining this, there is no perfect solution to how we can communicate in our team, but one thing we should keep in mind is that finding solutions is just a process. There are a variety of solutions we can potentially do, and so finding those out, getting those solutions, that's the important work that we need to accomplish. Ideally, we need to work together as a whole, not just individually, not just as QA, not just as developers, but as the whole team. And we need to set expectations early. What will be done each sprint? Sort that out at the beginning of sprint planning, not just halfway through the sprint and go, actually, I think this is too much. We need to talk about these things early on, set expectations, set boundaries, set understanding early, because at the end of the day, everyone is responsible for quality. And we as testers need to make sure everyone understands that, because not only does it make our jobs easier if everyone understands and truly embodies that saying, but it makes the whole team work well together. And that brings us to the end of today's webinar, so I'm happy to take any questions if there are in the chat. However, I do know that I'm a little bit running over time today, so no worries if not. I understand that people need to dip, but before you dip, if you are watching this webinar and of course did enjoy it, then if you're not already following us on LinkedIn, why not go ahead and give us a follow over there? We'll keep you up to date with our currently available webinars and any other information with Go Bigger. Plus, if you want to stay super up to date with us, why not go ahead and check out our shop to see our available workshop and courses. Currently, we have the Robot Framework Certified Professional course, but we are currently in development for some more courses there. So why not go ahead, check it out, and let us know if you like anything. Plus, if you book a course with more than 2 weeks notice, you'll save 10% off the course price. And if you want to know even more about us and keep up to date with all of our current available offerings, then why not go ahead and sign up for our newsletter so you can grow bigger. Every month we send you one email keeping you up to date with our currently available with our not only the previous month's webinars, but also the upcoming webinars for next month, plus information like testing conferences or important testing news that we think should be shared. You have nothing to lose by signing up, and you can always unsubscribe if you want to. So, for now though, this has been today's Webinar Wednesday, looking at communicating with developers. I'm happy to take any questions if there are, but otherwise, I wish you the best of luck with the rest of your week, and thank you for joining me today. I'll just give it a minute to see if there are any questions, but I don't believe there are. So once again, thanks everyone for joining.